Damn, you're Morefine. That's right folks, looks like the random business name generator is working on overdrive. Today, we're checking out the Morefine M600 mini PC, featuring AMD's latest and greatest Ryzen 6900HX, an 8-core 16-thread CPU with RDNA 2 graphics. Also, say hello to DDR5 and USB 4 support. I bought the Morefine M600 barebones unit from the official website. It needs DDR5 memory, storage, and OS, but pre-built options are available for extra. At $629 for the barebones, it's $129 more than the Minis Forum UM690, but it's superior to that Mini in a few ways, and also has its own shortcomings. In the box, you'll pretty much find everything you get with the UM690, including a vertical stand, HDMI cable, SATA expansion cable, 120 watt power supply, monitor mount, and screws. While the Minis Forum UM690 sticks close to the Intel NUC size of 4x4 inch, Morefine has done what I've talked about recently, which is to make a mini PC a bit bigger, as the wattage has shot up with the new generations and produces more heat. The larger 5.8 inch by 5.7 allows it to have better cooling and an additional storage slot. I'm really glad Morefine went with an aluminium alloy case for the Mini, as it really gives a premium feel and is solid AF. It's definitely Morefine, but I did notice some manufacturing blemishes on the top plastic lid, with some of the print design missing small chunks around the outer edge. It's not a big deal, but for the price Morefine is charging, I don't think this top lid should have passed quality control. I also have to give a thumbs down to the quick start guide. It doesn't show how to open or upgrade the unit and has nothing useful. Like, why would you even print this? Port selection is a bit different to the UM690. USB 4 is on the front and there's dual USB 3 Type A. On the back there are 3 USB 2 ports, another USB 3 along with a HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.4. HDMI 2.1 supports up to 8K, as does USB 4. The DisplayPort 1.4 will get you 4K. Another difference with the M600 is dual 2.5 gigabit LAN jacks. A useful feature for some, but not for everyone. The audio jack is also here. The M600 is another mini PC where the rubber feet are covering the screws instead of being elsewhere like some of that Intel NUC engineering. Once you've ripped them all off and removed the 4 screws, give it a good shake or a pry to push out the lid, whatever manhandling you prefer. Inside is a large fan and heatsink with lots of copper, so I expect good cooling performance. There's one PCIe Gen 4 M.2 slot with SATA support, and the CMOS battery is here. So, where are the RAM slots? That's where a proper manual would come in handy.
5 minutes later.
Okay, I've solved the Rubik's Cube. There are 2 screws on the back, and then the top lid needs to come off. Shaking doesn't work, and it's hard to get in between. I found it easiest to place the screwdriver in the holes and then push the lid out. Be careful not to rip out those Wi-Fi cables when you open it. So the top lid has space for a 2.5 inch storage drive and the SATA cable plugs in here. There's another M.2 Gen 4 slot which again supports SATA, and the M.2 Wi-Fi card is replaceable. I'll just add the DDR5 memory before closing her up. You might have noticed there are no heat sinks or thermal pads for the M.2 drives included. For my Linux test, Ubuntu fires up fine off the USB, but there were audio playback issues, which will probably be solved with an install and driver update. If you do buy a pre-build, you'll have Windows pre-installed and ready to go. The BIOS is one of the less fine features of the unit, and I'm going to cover that later in the video. Let's look at its performance benchmarks with default settings and see how it compares to the Minis Forum UM690, which I reviewed before this. In single core performance, the two perform identically. In multi-core, the UM690 is ahead by less than 0.5%, also known as no meaningful difference. The same for the video encoding test. Moving on to graphics, the UM690 was again slightly ahead in DX11 by 1.5% and 2.5% in DX12. So the M600 has a slight drop in 3D Mark, but let's see the performance in actual games. I'm putting the Morefine M600 side by side with the UM690, both at its base memory speed and overclocked. All games are 1080p low. In Doom Eternal, it's performing pretty much as expected with a similar frame rate to the UM690. But in Forza Horizon 5, well, pause. Look at that. A big difference in frame rate. In my review of the UM690, I mentioned one of the negatives being the inconsistent performance. I think it's due to the VRM getting too hot over time, as the CPU temp here is actually higher for the M600. Anyway, moving on. With my capture of Elden Ring, performance is similar. Same with Cyberpunk 2077. And God of War as well. So, at 1080p low, these minis are pretty solid entry-level gaming machines. My emulation captures are another area where the minis forum UM690 performed worse. The Morefine M600 is clearly beating the UM690 at the base memory speed, and it's not far behind 6000 MHz either. On to PS3 emulation, and the M600 wins outright with a higher frame rate against the UM690. Faster memory or not. In Skate 3, again the M600 comes out on top, and it's by a huge margin. In MotorStorm, it's a pretty close result overall. So, there's a few takeaways from this. The Morefine M600 is a consistent performer, and to make sure, I fired up Doom Eternal.
20 minutes later.
Okay, same result. That's great to see. Is it possible there was a problem with my Minis Forum UM690 unit? Possible? Sure. But I've seen this inconsistent performance across mini PCs before. Whatever the case, I'm not going to hide what was clearly an issue I encountered with it. Of course, CPU temperature is not the only metric that affects performance, but very few VRMs have temperature sensors. I was planning to at least test the Thunderbolt 3 eGPU with the M600, but my Razer Core X wasn't detected by the mini PC at all. I tried various settings in the BIOS, but no go. The USB 4 port does work fine when I connect an external SSD, so it is working. I've reached out to Morefine for support, and will let you know if I get it working in the comments. Back to the BIOS. It has every setting ever created instead of what you need. There's been no housekeeping, and it's a pain to use. There are even options for NVIDIA discrete GPUs that haven't been hidden. Anyway, I'll show you some of the useful options. To get into the BIOS, mash the delete key when you power it on. Use your keyboard to go to advanced, then AMD CBS and SMU common options. On the Morefine product page, they specify 45 watts as the default TDP of the CPU. However, the default auto mode seemed to go to 54 anyway. I tried both auto mode and 54 watts and got almost the same benchmark scores in Cinebench and 3D Mark. You can also change the fan curve here. In NBIO common options, you can change the amount of VRAM dedicated to the iGPU. If you're doing it manually, I recommend 4GB for a 16GB kit, and 4 or 8GB is fine for 32. Or you can use the auto options or the game optimized setting. If we go back and into UMC common, and then DDR options, then DDR timing configuration, and enable active memory timing settings, we can set the DDR5 memory speed. However, I do want to point out that the same DDR5 RAM kit, which overclocked to 6000 MHz on the UM690, wouldn't go higher than 5400 MHz here. Same with other kits I tested. I don't know if this is a BIOS issue, but it's as if 5400 MHz is the hard limit, and that'll net you an extra 3 or 4% in GPU performance. It also isn't fun to test higher speeds, as there's no easy access to a CMOS reset button like there was on the UM690. I had to disconnect the CMOS battery, which isn't easy to reconnect again. especially with my larger hands. There is a reset button in the case, but it seems to be just a regular reset. Holding it down for 10 seconds while the unit was off didn't clear the BIOS settings. In any case, I think a BIOS update is needed to at least clean up the options that aren't relevant to this Mini. If not, also to improve memory overclocking. Idle power draw was identical between the two Minis. The M600 hit a higher max power draw, but nothing to be worried about. By default, Morefine has set this Mini to a low fan speed for minimal noise, and it's impressively quiet for the wattage. It's easily the quietest 100 watt mini PC around this size I've reviewed so far. With my constant aim to provide better data, I've come up with a better method to test NVMe drive temperatures, and it starts with the M600. Now I've got the drive temperature and the controller temperature for a more accurate picture. And since there's no cooling on the M.2 drives, the controller temperature can get really high when writing a lot of data. Maximum CPU temp was slightly higher than the UM690, but as I've shown in the gaming tests, it performed better overall. Okay, so now let's go through what I think is more fine and less fine with the M600 6900HX. The metal chassis is great, and how all high-end minis should be built. It's got dual Gen 4 NVMe drives and SATA for storage options. The M600 is a quiet mini PC, which is nice to see. It's got consistent performance. Whether it's 10 minutes or an hour, it performed well. Now the less fine aspects. The price. At $130 more than the UM690, it's definitely not cheap, even with the extras you get. And the limited warranty is only 1 year compared to 2 years for the UM690. The BIOS is a mess, and memory overclocking doesn't work as well as with the UM690. But this isn't a problem for those that will just use the Mini as is. No thermal pads are included, and the NVMe drive gets hot. While the USB 4 port works, I wasn't able to get my Razer Core X working. I'll see if it can be solved with more fine support. Overall, it's the better mini PC, but definitely not a slam dunk, especially with that price increase. Anyway, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Is it a more fine or less fine mini PC for you? But before you go, do check out the Minis Forum UM690 to see what's on offer with a cheaper unit. Also, the Morefine M600 Ryzen 6600U review is coming soon, so watch out for that. Cheers!